Hi guys, this video is on the subject matter changing ecosystems, and it's the first one. This is part 1. So let's begin by looking at our learning goals for this lesson. So by the end of this lesson, hopefully you'll be able to 1. Explain the concept of ecological succession, and in doing this you'll refer to pioneer and climax community as well as seers. So that's our changing ecosystems learning goal 1, and the second learning goal for this lesson is to differentiate between the 2 modes of succession, which are primary and secondary succession. So let's begin. When we look at ecological succession, the first definition to get down is ecological succession is the progressive change of communities over time. So let's say you're starting off with a sand dune and there's nothing but complete bare sand in this sand island. Well, initially you're going to get some particular plants, which we'll later refer to as pioneer species, starting to grow and develop there. And as they change the abiotic conditions, well, what's going to happen? You're going to get different plants coming. So progressive change. And then as you get those plants, well, they change the abiotic conditions further. They allow other plants to grow. And eventually we reach what we'll refer to as the climax community. So when we consider succession, it is this progressive change over time. So communities, they do change progressively over time because one community ends up being replaced by the next. So consider this, and I know it kind of shows as if we're heading this way, but consider these as the same bit of land. So initially you've got these plants here, okay? And again, as I said, as they're changing some of those conditions, that enables shrubs to grow. As shrubs change those abiotic conditions and biotic conditions, young forests can grow in that same area, and then you get a mature forest, and eventually by 150 to 300 years in this particular ecosystem, you can reach a climax forest. Now, every different ecosystem is going to have a different rate of change, and also what that climax looks like. It doesn't always have to be a forest. The climax community might be prairie grass or cactuses. But the idea of succession is we're getting a change in that community over time, and it is very progressive. So during succession, as I mentioned, each stage changes the abiotic conditions and biotic conditions of that environment. So when we look at succession, we'll start here with this idea of a pioneer community and eventually, hopefully, reaching that climax community. Now, not every community will actually reach that climax as well, because sometimes you get factors like fires and that, which can come in and interfere with those processes. So when we consider pioneer species, now this is something that you have to be able to refer to when looking at succession. Pioneer species are species that can colonize bare ground. So examples of pioneer species might be lichen or fungi or mosses. So these are species which can come in and colonize that bare ground. They're the initial ones there in this idea of succession, those plants that, I guess, pioneer or pave the way for those other plant species later on who come into the environment. So the end point in succession is where a relatively stable community, which we call a climax community, is reached. So once this community is relatively stable, so basically the overall biomass does not vary much, that's when we say it's reached this climax community. And it is important to note that a climax community isn't always some big grand forest, okay? It can be simple things like prairie grass, or as I mentioned, cactus. In the beach sand dune, it would be that sort of like woodland area that you get. So that climax community is the end point of succession. Pioneers started off, climax is the end. So hopefully you can understand those 2 different ideas when we look at succession. When we consider climax communities, they tend to be made up of these slow-growing, long-lived, K-selected species. Now, if you remember those K-selected species, they are those more long-lived, mature ones, okay? Those ones that eventually reach that sort of carrying capacity, unlike those R-selected, which have that rapid J population growth. And they're therefore able to outcompete the other species around them, okay? So these trees, because they provide shade, will outcompete some of those pioneer species and those later species that come in like grasses because of their ability to, I guess, be long-lived and change those conditions in that environment. So when we look at each stage of succession, we refer to it as a seral community or seer. So seer is early in succession, so if we were to look here, so this earlier seers, so for example this pioneer, well, they tend to have lower species diversity and a simpler structure. Then eventually what we reach is the climax community. So you can see these intermediate stages here in succession in the community that's heading towards a climax community we refer to as a sear. So you can see we've got these different sears here in succession leading up to our climax community. So hopefully that makes sense and you can use that term, and we'll have a practice of using that term a bit later on. So when we look at ecological succession, you can see that the composition of that community is going to change with time. So the past seral communities, those ones that have occurred previously, say for example these pioneer species, well, they obviously were not able to tolerate the changes in the environment over time, so they might no longer be present in that environment. And initially, there is lower diversity within that community. The present seral community, will modify those abiotic factors in the environment through their different activities, and that can then lead the way for future seral communities. So changes in the present sear allow new species to establish and make up the future seral community, which will tend to have a higher diversity there. So think about ecological succession as each of these sears, so the organisms there, paving the way or making the way for the eventual climax community to be established. So the next learning goal, so we're starting here, the learning goal number 2, is to understand or differentiate between the two types of succession, which are primary and secondary succession. Quickly looking at this diagram, hopefully you can see there's a clear difference between the two initially, but each involve these same changes over time. Now this here, D, could look exactly the same in both primary and secondary succession. The key thing that we're going to refer to or look at when we're looking at the differences here is what's going on in the very sort of initial stages here. And that's where the big difference between primary and secondary succession will take place. So when we look at primary succession, a definition to get down is a type of ecological succession occurring in a region where there is no pre-existing vegetation. And this is the key thing for you guys to highlight: no pre-existing vegetation or soil. Okay, so no pre-existing vegetation or soil. So it begins with bare rock. So initially you'll have bare rock, like in this. It's then colonized by those pioneer species, and we'll look at greater detail of what those type of species are and how they do this. An example in this case might be moss. They then decompose, and that's sort of weathering and breakdown of rock material, as well as the organic matter they themselves add, start to create a layer of topsoil. As that layer of topsoil develops, that enables plants such as grasses to grow, and they'll displace those other pioneer species. So here grasses might displace that moss which was initially growing there. Then as more nutrients are added, because again more organic matter has been added there, more rocks breaking down, you're getting larger amounts of soil, you're getting more nutrients, you're getting greater water holding capacity in that soil, you start to get shrub growth. So again, as those shrubs are growing, they're getting deeper roots, they're further breaking down that soil. Again, more nutrients, more leaf litter, greater water holding capacity, and eventually it results in what we call that climax community. So in primary succession, you can see there you're starting with this bare rock, so no pre-existing soil, and as these different organisms that enter into that environment change the abiotic conditions, you're eventually reaching that climax community. So going through this in a bit more detail, primary succession begins in a place without any soil. So what conditions can make that up? Well, it might be sides of a volcano. After a volcanic eruption, it will clear basically anything that is on that surface, and it's replaced by that lava. This could be landslides, again, tearing through that environment, flooding, or even on the dune system. So looking at those sand dune ecosystems there. So they are places without any soil to begin. So the next part of primary succession begins the arrival of those pioneer species. Now pioneer species, say on bare rock, might be lichen, which establish themselves on a sand dune ecosystem. It might be plants like spinifex, which are initially enter in, and they are the pioneer species. So as soil starts to form as lichen, for instance, work through. So lichen release acid, which start to break down that rock. Weathering's going to occur in that rock, which breaks it down. You start to get this soil forming. Then when lichen themselves die, they decompose. And this adds initially a small amount of organic matter to that rock. So we've now got bare rock. We started with that, and well, I should say we had bare rock. We've now got lichen breaking down that rock, weathering occurring, organic matter added. You're now starting to form some soil. That allows simple plants like mosses, which might enter. And these mosses, for example, have a symbiotic relationship. So one that benefits both with cyanobacteria, which can fix nitrogen. And as you're going to learn, or have learned, nitrogen is an essential nutrient in the soil. And therefore, by having this relationship with cyanobacteria, they can get nitrogen themselves, because the soil is quite low in any form of nutrient at the moment. But they also are therefore adding important nitrogen to the soil as they decompose and break down, which enables other plants to grow. So you might get some plants like ferns and things like that that are distributed by spores, and other plants that are distributed by seeds starting to now come into this environment. So those simple plants begin to die. That adds more organic material, and you start to get, as I said, those plants like grasses, maybe wildflowers, and other plants beginning to take over. And again, as they die, you're getting this process, adding more nutrients to the soil. So they die, more nutrients, shrubs and trees can now start to grow in this environment. And we've also started to get other organisms like animals coming in. For example, you would start to get insects, pollinators coming into that environment there because you've got those flowers. So again, this whole ecosystem and the diversity is beginning to change over time, this progressive change. Now, as those particular shrubs and plants and trees provide greater shade, break up that rock, eventually you're able to reach this climax community. And you've had a whole variety of other animals that have also been able to come in. So you're going to get small birds and mammals that have begun to move into that ecosystem as you've had those trees and those different plant communities develop there. And that is the idea of primary succession. So let's just go through a little bit of an example here just to hopefully get that full understanding. So we begin with bare rock, and this might be after the retreat of a glacier in this example. So as that ice melts, it leaves bare rock exposed. It begins with pioneer species like lichen, mosses colonizing that rock. And as these organisms die, organic matter is added to the weather rock, and that particle begins to make simple soil. Then, as that soil develops, that enables plants like grasses and small herbaceous plants to grow. Again, more organic matter is added, and roots aid in that weathering of that rock material. That then allows deeper soils to form, which hold more water, which can enable plants like small shrubs to colonize, which again makes the soils better. You're getting increase in nutrient availability as well, and you get more root action occurring. So all of these changes are resulting in eventually trees establishing themselves into this relatively stable community we refer to as a climax community, which is now growing on mature soils. You might like to just get that bit of a flow down just for yourself so you can get this idea of the different stages that are occurring in primary succession. The key idea though, this starts on bare rock, and then here you get these different sears, these intermediate stages, eventually ending in what we refer to as a climax community. So when we look at secondary succession, let's compare the difference here. So secondary succession occurs in areas where a community that previously existed has been removed. So you can look at this, we've got a previous community, it's been destroyed by fire. This now begins the idea of secondary succession, because we're going to get a progressive change. This relatively stable community is now being destroyed. We're now going to get progressive change, so we're having succession, and the difference here, yes, we'll reach a climax community just like primary, but the difference is we are not beginning with bare rock or no vegetation. We're actually beginning with potentially some quite good high nutrient soil, particularly after a fire, if it's in this case. A lot of that nutrients return to the soil, and therefore it is going to have a different sort of speed and flow to primary succession there. But the same simple ideas will exist. So when the dominant species of a plant community is removed, so this may be through fire, disease, storms, human interference, say with habitat destruction, secondary succession will occur. So the idea of secondary succession is you are now starting with actual soil because of some initial disturbance. Now remember, you have to be able to differentiate with primary succession where we're starting with bare rock, okay? So now we actually have soil because this has resulted in some sort of the disruption and the previous community is being removed. So these small scale disturbances do not eliminate all life or nutrients from the environment. So you have a much better starting point, okay? You're actually able to get things with soil growing right away. So secondary succession is invariably faster than primary succession. Why? Because you have that existing soil, and that's the key idea here. So previously bare rock, now we have existing soil, and species of plants and animals present in the area are being colonized. So yes, we might have some environmental disturbance, which say for example even with farming, okay, but you have good soil, you've got some organisms around in this environment, and secondary succession will start here because we're going to get that progressive change over time. So when we look at secondary succession, we have an established climax community that is disturbed in some way, okay, there's some disturbance which destroys that community. That biota is removed, so the living organisms are removed, but the soil remains. Then, obviously, same like with primary succession, you're going to get pioneer species like grasses, those initial organisms that tend to be distributed by seeds, okay, in the air, through the wind, even birds. Those fast-growing species will grow and initially dominate. Over time, as they change those conditions again, you'll eventually lead to that re-establishment of the climax community in that ecosystem there. So the whole idea, again, is pioneer species such as weeds and grasses will grow back first, and then fast-growing trees will develop, and then shade-tolerant plants will survive in the understory. Over time, you're getting those changes, and then this sear is eventually then overtaken by the climax community. So you can see here, we've got this sear of fast-growing plants that's eventually taken over by the climax community, which will establish itself in that particular area. So let's look at some of the key differences and similarities between primary and secondary succession. Remember, your learning goal here is to differentiate between the two of them. I strongly recommend getting this table down in your books so you have something that you can refer to that's very quick. So primary succession, well, that will start on bare rock, okay? So when we look at primary succession, one of the key differences here is it begins on bare rock, where in secondary succession you already have soil present. In primary succession, well, your pioneer species are going to be those plants such as lichen and moss. Now, lichen is one of those pioneer organisms we'll look at later that's composed of fungi or algae or cyanobacteria, all kind of composite together there, and that enables them to photosynthesize, which makes them great pioneer species to be able to establish on bare rock. However, in secondary succession, you're going to get those species like grasses that grow first. They tend to be distributed by the wind, and their seeds can be blown over large distances to enter in there. So they are going to be your pioneer species in that type of ecosystem there during secondary succession. In primary succession, you have no previous life. They're established particularly after something like a glacier retreat. Or a secondary succession, well, this occurs in areas where organisms lived previously. So we've had a community, there's been a disturbance, okay, which has destroyed that community or severely damaged it. Now we're starting again, okay, but we've had previous life and we've already got soil present. And then some examples. Well, secondary succession, that can occur after things like a glacier retreat or a volcanic eruption. And they've actually shown primary succession can occur quite quickly after a volcanic eruption. It shocks scientists how quickly this ecosystem can sort of adapt to those changes. For example, in Krakatoa in Indonesia, with that massive eruption, which was even heard in Sydney, what happened there is over 100 years, you've gone from this volcanic rock bare ground to actually once again establishing that rainforest on that ecosystem, going through those stages we looked at. So the fact that those lichen came in and moss, and then you got grass and shrubs and larger trees, and eventually getting back to that original rainforest. Where in secondary succession, you're getting events such as fire and land clearing, being two probably predominant ones that occur in Australia, that are removing that previous community there. And the fact is, in Australia, our plants have adapted quite well to fire, so it recovers quite quickly. And we've noticed those large bushfires, And if you've been looking at or lived in areas or gone to the coast where it got hit quite badly, you can see the fact that that ecosystem has recovered remarkably fast, especially with those plants like eucalypts and wattles, those Australian plants that have those adaptations to regrow quickly after fires if they're not completely destroyed by them. So in this idea of secondary succession, it is occurring after a previous event. You've got soil already there. Primary succession, it's starting on bare rock, and this occurs where there's no previous life. There are some similarities between the two. So some of the similarities is both of these will eventually end in a climax community. So you're getting that idea of that climax community eventually reached. Now, again, I will make that point that it doesn't always result in the climax community. If you're in an ecosystem that's hit by fire quite often, you may never reach that climax community having established that. Small shrubs and trees will grow, so both of them, you're getting those small trees and shrubs going, and they occur over long periods of time. So these aren't events. If we go to some agriculturally cleared land, within a year, you're not getting that forest back again. That takes a long time for those larger organisms to re-establish themselves to form that stable climax community there. So if you want to practice a bit more and have a bit of fun in a visual kind of way, there is a game I can recommend. Click on primary succession, click on secondary succession, and have a go at that. Hopefully, guys, you've, I guess, learnt those two key learning goals that we had here. The first one, you can understand ecological succession as that progressive change in the community over time, and be able to use those terms like pioneers, okay? So those organisms that are first going to establish themselves during succession, and climax community, that relatively stable community that is eventually, in some communities, reached at the end of succession. And you understand what a seer is, that intermediate community in succession leading up to that climax community there. So you're getting those individual stages or communities that eventually lead up there. And also that you can differentiate between primary and secondary succession. The idea of primary starting on bare rock with no previous life occurring after, say, for example, glaciers or a volcanic eruption, a glacier retreat or a volcanic eruption, and secondary succession, which occurs in a community that previously had life and soil is therefore present there, and they occur after things such as fire, floods, droughts, or human interference with clearing the land. Hopefully you get all that, guys, and go on to video 2 after this, so you can start to learn a bit more about succession and these learning goals there.